One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains politics, policy and economics in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. It's been 12 years since Julian Assange was last free. The Australian publisher and WikiLeaks founder faces charges from the United States government for publishing thousands of sensitive military and government documents. He's currently in prison in the United Kingdom and facing extradition to the United States. Recently, US President Joe Biden told reporters that he is considering Australia's request to drop the charges against Assange.
Do you have a response to Australia's request that you end Julian Assange's prosecution?
We're considering.
Will you pardon Julian Assange?
Well, I'm going to talk about that today, and we're going to give it very serious consideration.
And last week, judges in the United Kingdom granted Assange leave to appeal against his extradition to the United States. But he's not free yet.
Welcome back. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange overnight had a major victory in the UK High Court, winning
the High Court in London has, at least for now, blocked the extradition of the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the United States.
Australian WikiLeaks founder can continue appealing his extradition.
It means his legal fight here in the United Kingdom continues.
They weren't satisfied by assurances that were given by the US government that Assange would be able to rely on the US constitutional right to freedom of speech because he is not a US citizen.
Assange had argued as an Australian citizen he risked being denied full First Amendment protections.
As a family we're relieved, but how long can this go on?
This was always political. It remains political. I think the solution is political.
Mr Assange has already paid a significant price and enough is enough.
Leading media outlets as well as press freedom advocates warning the espionage charges against Assange threaten to set a dangerous precedent.
To discuss the latest in Julian Assange's long fight for freedom, I recently sat down with Jennifer Robinson, international human rights lawyer and legal advisor to Julian Assange. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer. I know you must be absolutely flat out.
It's great to be here, Ebony. Thanks so much for the invitation. And it was a late night being up, watching the hearing and staying up to deal with it, and then up early on Australian radio this morning. So sleep.
I bet. So obviously we've seen this case overnight happening in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about what the outcome of that was? Because there was a possibility he could have been extradited to the United States overnight had things have gone differently.
That's right. It was a very tense wait yesterday as the judges deliberated on their decision. So in the morning, I was joining remotely here from Australia. I'm here working on Julian's case and other various matters, so I couldn't be there in person. But we heard yesterday morning from the US and from our counsel on the nature of the US assurances. So it was a tense wait for Julian and for his family when the judges went out to deliberate. They could have chosen to extradite him to the United States and refused our permission to appeal. Thankfully, it went the other way. So it's a huge relief for Stella and for the children, for Julian himself and for all of us that have been fighting so hard to stop him from being sent to the United States. But of course, it's only a temporary reprieve. So the fact that we've been given leave to appeal means that we're now going to have another hearing. It remains to be seen when that hearing will be listed for. It could take it could be months. It could be later in the year. We don't know. But he's still at risk of extradition. And that's the thing that everybody needs to realize. We haven't won yet. This is just one win along a very, very long road. And in the meantime, he remains in prison.
And I was just going to ask about some of the details that were decided on in this case. Obviously, he's been given leave to appeal, but what were the judges essentially deciding on? What is the legal principles at stake here or that you are seeking to appeal on?
It has been incredibly complicated, the entire appeal process. I'm happy to give you a little overview of where we are.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Thank you.
For those on the call, you will remember that Julian was arrested in 2019 and taken to Belmarsh prison on a US extradition request, the US extradition request that everyone said he was paranoid to be worried about. And we fought that extradition request through the courts. Now, we won that case in early 2021 on the grounds of the medical evidence, which showed that the particular mental health picture that Julian suffers, his autism, Asperger's diagnosis, and the oppressive prison conditions he would face if returned to the United States, or extradited rather, to the United States, would cause his suicide. Now, we won on that basis. So the judge said, you can't extradite him because it would be oppressive in these circumstances. These prison conditions will cause his death. So I'm going to bar extradition. She refused us on all other grounds, though. So we'd won on that one narrow ground. After that, the US obviously didn't like that outcome. And having had all the time in the world to make an assurance, they chose after the close of hearings and after the close of evidence and after the judgment to shift the goalposts and offer an assurance saying, don't worry, we won't put him under those prison conditions after all. That was a conditional assurance, and basically saying, unless he does something in the future that we say justifies it. And I think it's important to remember this history because basically the body with the power to decide to place him under the prison conditions that we say will cause his death are the intelligence services. And we now know that the intelligence services, the CIA, had planned to kidnap and kill him from the UK. So the UK courts waved through that assurance. We were not offered the opportunity to have the submissions and evidence that we've just heard overnight in relation to these latest round of assurances. We were not offered that opportunity, and the US waved through the assurance. So then we were in a position where his extradition was ordered by the Home Secretary. We then appealed that decision, saying it was unreasonable for her to extradite in these circumstances. And we appealed all of the outstanding grounds that we'd lost on in the first round of the case. So that appeal was heard earlier this year, and the judgment was handed down in March. What this court that heard the matter again last night decided was they would refuse us on all of our grounds except three. And those three were that if our argument that if Julian is extradited to the United States, the facts as they appear on the indictment, he could be subjected to an offence, being prosecuted for an offence that attracts a death penalty. And the US had not offered any assurances to that fact. And the judge was very troubled by that. So we were given provisional leave to appeal on that basis, but on the basis that the courts were going to allow the US to again remedy what we say is a fundamentally flawed case by offering a new assurance about the death penalty. The other two grounds relate to his Australian nationality as an award-winning Australian journalist, and the free speech protections that he will not be entitled to once he gets to the United States. So we pointed out that the US prosecutor is arguing that he will not benefit from constitutional free speech protections under the First Amendment once he's extradited to the United States. And that's on the basis that he is a foreign national, an Australian citizen. So the judge was very troubled by that again. The two judges were very troubled by that again, and rightly so. Basically, what the US is saying is that they will exercise criminal jurisdiction over journalists anywhere in the world. But once you're in the United States, because you are a foreigner or Australian or British or any other nationality, and you publish truthful information about us from outside of the US, you won't get any constitutional protections, but we'll still prosecute you and send you to prison. So thankfully, the judges were concerned about that, but again, offered the US the opportunity to remedy the case and said, well, if we want to see a satisfactory assurance. In the last month or so, the US came up with what they were assurances. In respect of the death penalty, it was a stock standard death penalty assurance, which is standard in cases involving the United States because very few countries will extradite to a country that has the death penalty. So the US is accustomed to giving these assurances all the time. We don't know why they hadn't bothered in Julian's case, and it took 5 years for them to get to that point, but we now have it. But the assurance in respect of First Amendment is far more concerning and sticky, and that's what the thrust of the argument last night was about. So what the US has come back and said in response to the concerns we've raised and the concerns that the judges agree with, that there's a real risk he'll be discriminated against and a court would find that he does not benefit from constitutional protections. The US said, well, when he comes back, he can seek to rely on it, but it's a matter for the courts as to whether it would in fact apply. Now, of course, we all know the separation of powers, so the executive can't bind the courts. But what you need to understand about that assurance is that there's a clear line of case law in the United States which says precisely this: as a foreign citizen outside of the country, you do not benefit from constitutional protections for that action, including First Amendment protections. And so what the US is saying is this is no assurance at all. You're not giving us any kind of guarantee. It doesn't guarantee that the prosecutor's not going to run this argument, which is something they could say. They could say, we will guarantee that the prosecutor will not run that argument. But they also can't protect us and Julian against the fact that the court might, of its own volition, rule that he's not entitled to those constitutional protections. So the US is in a really difficult legal position here, which is illustrated by the fact we've now got permission. It's a huge blow to their case, and one that I think could be insurmountable. It remains to be seen. So we've got to have another whole hearing later in the year about this. So the key question now is, will he, as an Australian citizen and national and journalist and publisher, be entitled to the First Amendment, or will he be discriminated against on the grounds of his nationality? And we say he will be, and that cannot be remedied.
Yeah, well, on the face of it, it certainly appears that way. And as you said, kind of mystifying when the United States, on the other matter, on the death penalty implication there, generally gives that as a matter of course, and failed to do that for 5 years in this instance doesn't exactly inspire confidence. But can you tell me a little bit more about what is at stake there? So people will be familiar with the free speech rights and constitutional right to free speech in the United States, not something that we enjoy here in Australia. But it seems to me, obviously, one of the key principles at stake here, and one of the reasons why people kind of waved off this idea that he might be indicted in the first place, because at stake here is this idea of free speech, but also freedom of the press, two fundamental principles that the United States holds dear and are in their constitution. And you know, this case puts a lot of those issues at stake in a very clear way, obviously complicated by the fact that he isn't American. But can you talk to me a little bit more about those legal implications for free speech in particular, but also for freedom of the press, and why this case is so important, not just for Julian in the first place, but as a bigger legal principle at stake?
Of course. So we've been raising concern about the implications for the media more broadly since the very beginning, when the Obama administration opened the grand jury investigation back in 2010. So it's very serious for the media. And I think we talk about the so-called New York Times problem, a problem that the New York Times and the Washington Post have themselves acknowledged in saying that the indictment for Assange criminalizes public interest journalistic practices that we've engaged in for decades and that we do every day. So this is an indictment that absolutely criminalizes the receipt, possession, and publication of national security or defense information, which is what national security journalists and good journalists do all day, every day. What the US is trying to do with this precedent, and I want to make clear that there was no indictment under the Obama administration. This was a decision that was taken by the Trump administration back in 2016-17, after WikiLeaks published the CIA material showing the extent of US spying around the world. They really decided to pursue this indictment. And that was an indictment pursued by the Trump administration, who calls the media the enemy of the people. And so the New York Times General Counsel has called that himself the New York Times problem. As you cannot distinguish between the acts of what Julian did in this case, or is alleged to have done in this case, which is to have communications with a source, to talk to a source about how to provide the information, to receive the information from that source, hold that information, and publish it. This is straight up journalistic activity, and straight up activity that the mainstream media engages in all the time. So the US cannot distinguish between what Julian did and what WikiLeaks is purported to have done and what the mainstream media does every day. So there was, for a very long time, and it was quite frustrating for us, I have been a broken record on this issue since 2010. It's been 14 long years of making this point, which is you cannot somehow distinguish or put WikiLeaks and Julian over there or other them. And the fact that a lot of the media did that, they shot themselves in the foot, because that created the political circumstances that made it possible for an administration like the Trump administration to pursue this indictment, which will affect everyone. And it's not just everyone in the United States. So I think the US media is very alert to what this will mean for them as a precedent, but it's affecting everyone. So Julian was publishing this US information. He was not in the United States. He wasn't in the US at the time. He's not a US citizen. He doesn't have any obligations to the United States government. He's a publisher. And yet they are seeking to exercise their jurisdiction beyond their borders because of purported damage to US national security to bring someone into their jurisdiction to prosecute them criminally without constitutional protection. And that should be concerning for every journalist and editor everywhere in the world. And that's why we've seen adverts run in the United Kingdom, in the Times, for example, saying the UK is no longer a safe place for media workers. And they're right.
They are right. And it's, as you said, it's the basics of journalism and seeking really to criminalise journalists and the act of publishing this kind of thing. And as you say, it's the basis for so much investigative reporting is the receipt of classified or secret government documents, not just in the national security space, but in a whole range of spaces.
Absolutely.
And it is encouraging to see that other people are, beginning to understand how much is at stake here and the implications that this is how far the US government can reach or how far the US justice system can reach without also that obligation of the constitutional protections afforded to any American citizen is obviously really diabolical. But I want to come back to that this was a decision under the Trump administration, that this is essentially a political prosecution, and what it is that is at the heart of this, which is I think that WikiLeaks embarrassed the US government because, correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of national security implications, like nobody has been harmed by any of these leaks. And the great care was essentially taken to make sure that wasn't the case. It is very good journalism. What do we know about what WikiLeaks revealed and the reason why the US government and the Trump administration in particular might have chosen to pursue this case against Julian?
It's a great question. So it's really important to remember what this indictment's actually about, because WikiLeaks has published a raft of information over the past 14 years. The indictment only relates to the material that was released in 2010 and 2011. And so when we talk about that, it's the Guantanamo Bay files, which showed that what we all suspected but then saw on paper is that all of these people were being locked up in Guantanamo without basis, effectively, in many cases, or in most cases, without basis. So it was the Guantanamo Bay files, the Afghan and Iraq war logs, and the US diplomatic cables. Also the Iraqi rules of engagement. There's a lot of people who say, well, one of the most famous WikiLeaks publications, I think, is Collateral Murder. So the gunship video where you see Americans killing journalists, Reuters journalists and civilians in Iraq. That was material that was released. Chelsea Manning has spoken publicly about having released that material, and she released that material to WikiLeaks with the rules of engagement, which WikiLeaks published together to show that what the US had been saying publicly about the death of those Reuters journalists was false, and that they had not complied with their own rules of engagement, and it was in fact a war crime. So that publication is absolutely part of the indictment, because Julian is being prosecuted for having published the rules of engagement, if not the video itself. So these are the kinds of disclosures that we're talking about here are the fact evidence of US war crimes, including collateral murder and the killing of Julian's colleagues, journalists from Reuters, the conduct of war crimes in the context of Iraq, so the use of torture, the killing of civilians on a scale that was not previously acknowledged by the US administration when reporting the civilian deaths in the context of the Iraq war, was severely underreported. So the public was not in a position to know how many people were being killed as a result of the US's war and occupation. So these are really important, really important disclosures. Julian won the Sydney Peace Prize for these disclosures. He won the Walkley Award for these disclosures. And I could list for days the implication of Cablegate and the diplomatic cables, everything from revealing how the US stifled more ambitious climate action through their conduct behind closed doors, making threats, promising aid to vulnerable nations to stymie efforts to reduce our climate emissions earlier. Whether it's stymieing ICC prosecutions, it's a good day for international justice today to hear that Netanyahu and Israeli and Hamas leaders look like they'll be indicted by the ICC. But the US for years was running interference to try and stop the ICC from being able to do its work. And so I think, I could go on and on and on about the public interest in these stories and how we as lawyers have used that material. One of my favourite stories about WikiLeaks cables is about the Chagos Islands, and I'm not sure how many people on the call on the seminar will know about it, but the Chagos Islands is a territory that was part of like colonial times Mauritius that was administered by the British government. And when Mauritius got their independence, the islands were excised unlawfully and leased to the United States for a military base. And from that military base, we know that they've launched key strikes in the Middle East, but also used that island for, that lovely thing called extraordinary rendition. But there's been a huge dispute, a territorial dispute over those islands. So Mauritius wants the territory back, and the Chagos Islanders, who were forcibly removed from the islands to make way for the US military base, have been fighting for years. Between them, some in the UK, some in Mauritius, where they were pushed when the US came in for their military base, have been fighting for return to their homelands. Now, this all it's another of these sort of geopolitical issues that WikiLeaks revealed information about. But WikiLeaks cables showed a range of really interesting things about those islands. So it showed the very colonial way in which the British and the US were treating the islands and talking about it. It showed that the UK declared a marine park, purportedly for environmental reasons, around the Chagos Islands, but in fact they'd done it to try to stymie the Chagos Islanders' ability to return. Now, that material from WikiLeaks created massive international headlines, was then used in evidence in the British courts and accepted. WikiLeaks material was accepted as evidence in the British courts, and litigation then went all the way to the International Court of Justice in a case in which I acted, where Mauritius asked the International Court to make a ruling about the lawfulness or otherwise of British occupation of the territory. And I sat there, and in my own submissions and in the submissions of other countries, WikiLeaks material was cited. And when you see the impact of this material, we will be looking at the impact of this material for decades and generations to come. And yet the person responsible for making this available to the public, with hundreds of media partners around the world, is in prison. And I mean, I just think we'll look back on this time and think, how on earth did it take so long? How could we have allowed an award-winning publisher to sit in a British prison for this long? It is absurd to me. But I mean, I'm happy if people are interested to hear about WikiLeaks security procedures or what was done with respect to those publications and why it was responsible journalism. I'm very happy to explain any of those.
Yeah, we might come back to that in the questions from the audience. But I did kind of want to touch on that because, again, that's extraordinary to me as well. He's in a UK prison. He's being prosecuted by another Australian ally and supposing, leader of the free world, so to speak, and shining light for democracy, the United States. We all know that's been declining for a while now, but it does seem extraordinary that we find ourselves this far along and he is still imprisoned for journalism. How much is the Australian government, been active in lobbying, and does that have any impact on the UK as well as on the United States and the prosecution there? And then after that, I thought I might ask you about whistleblowers here in Australia, because I think we've seen some concerning developments here as well. But just, can you talk to me a little bit about someone who has practiced in the United Kingdom, that facing prosecution from another Australian ally, and yet this Australian award-winning journalist is in a United Kingdom prison, after many years on end and still no end in sight?
It's a really disappointing reflection of how the legal system can be weaponized, and I call it punishment by process, because he has been tied up. I can't even tell you the number of legal proceedings I've been involved with him in the last 14 years. He has been tied up in all kinds of different legal processes for the past 14 years that have restricted his liberty without conviction. So the only conviction he's ever had to serve in the last 14 years was for the purported bail breach when he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy to protect himself from US extradition. The only reason he is in Belmarsh is because of this US extradition request. And you asked about the role of Australia and what decision-making is happening between the UK, the US and Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, because of the nature of extradition proceedings, there's very little political discretion in the United Kingdom to take political decisions about this case. We're very much caught up in legal process. And as his legal counsel, we will continue to utilise every mechanism available to us to protect him from US extradition and to facing potentially not just a prosecution where he will not have the constitutional right to free speech, but prison conditions that the medical evidence shows will cause his death, we will absolutely use every avenue available to us to protect him from that outcome. But in the process, he's in prison for a really long time. But we are on that legal treadmill where there could be a circuit breaker of that legal treadmill is the Australian government's intervention with the United States. So the US government could at any time, the Department of Justice could at any time make the decision to drop this case. It is an indictment that was brought under the Trump administration. The Biden administration, the Obama administration chose not to pursue it. The Trump administration decided to pursue it. Since then, the Biden administration has put out new media guidelines saying we don't prosecute the media, but they are allowing this case to continue, this Trump-era legacy case to continue, which is really dangerous. But all they need to do is to decide to stop it, to agree with the Washington Post and the New York Times, with all these free speech groups, to comply with the request of the Australian government, their ally, to allow him to return home to Australia. It is actually a very straightforward request and one that could be resolved overnight with a decision from the Attorney General. And the prosecutors in the case.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. And I guess that brings me back to what's happening here on Australian soil. It's not directly connected to Julian's case, but I do think it is concerning. I'd be really interested in Australia's prosecutions of whistleblowers in our legal system, and obviously sends a similar message as Julian's case is designed to send to the media, but to whistleblowers, the people who source those documents and in the public interest choose to release them. Are you concerned at the way Australia is moving in this respect?
Absolutely, very concerned. And I do think that this falls into the broader pattern of what we're seeing in the United States and elsewhere and in established democracies like ours, where we're seeing in the United States, Obama prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other president combined. We've seen the use of the Espionage Act and incredibly draconian sentencing in the United States to prosecute whistleblowers who were state employees who made the principled decision to share information in the public interest with the media. Julian is in a different position to that, so I don't want to compare him to whistleblowers because he's a publisher and a journalist who received information and published it. But I do think what we're seeing in Australia with this raft of national security legislation that came in the past sort of 5 to 10 years, which includes incredibly long sentences and consequences for those who disclose national defence information. And I want to make special mention, of course, of David McBride and what we've just seen happen with David. He is a principled whistleblower who revealed the truth about war crimes in Afghanistan. And it is astonishing to me and a shame on our country that the only person who has faced prosecution for war crimes in Afghanistan is the person who revealed Australian war crimes. And for him to be sent to prison the way that he has, it is the first time in Australian history we're seeing a sentence of this nature for someone who's done that. And I think it sends absolutely the wrong message. We need better whistleblowing protections. And David McBride should not be in prison. It is a prosecution that should never have been brought, and that is, again, another one, thanks to Conservative government, Christian Porter this time, but the Labor government should have stopped it. And why they allow, that we've got these progressive governments who are allowing legacy prosecutions that should never have been brought in the first place to continue is wrong. Now, the argument that they will put, and that is put in respect of Julian's case, is, well, the Trump administration interfered politically with the DOJ. The DOJ is independent, and so we're not going to step in to stop this. But you have to take a principled decision, and allowing these precedents to be set is wrong. And it sends the wrong message to whistleblowers around the country, and it sends the wrong message to the Australian public.
And presumably it makes it harder for the Australian government to advocate in Julian's case when we're prosecuting whistleblowers at home, even if he's a publisher and not a whistleblower, as you said. Like the principles are pretty similar here about who we choose to prosecute, certainly.
Well, I think the better analogy is between what happened to the ABC over those publications. So we know that...
Yeah, they got raided and a number of journalists got raided.
So not only has David been prosecuted and now sent to prison, the source of the material and the whistleblower, but we saw that the ABC was raided. And that was a watershed in Australia to watch police raiding the ABC in relation to those publications. And that 100% is this Australia, a former Conservative government, picking up and running with what the precedent that we're seeing in Julian's case. And so that is a better analogy. Julian is not, he's often described as a whistleblower, and maybe in some ways you could say he is, but he is not in the same position as those who have obligations to a government. He is a publisher, he is a journalist, and there are different protections for journalists.
For good reason, because journalism in itself, investigative journalism, public interest journalism, is what we would call a public good. It is done in the public interest, and because the public has a right to know these things. So you're right, it's very different principles at work, but whistleblowers and journalism go hand in hand, I think, and that's important to note as well. Jennifer, I did want to ask just about the Australian government interventions here and how important you think that might be to be urgent, given there could possibly be another Trump presidency after the November elections. Do you have any thoughts on that? If the Biden administration were to drop the case, could he still be at risk from a future Trump presidency? Is there kind of a timing need to be considered here?
Well, I think the first thing to say, the urgency is really about Julian's health and well-being and the impact of this case on journalism around the world. So there should be an urgency irrespective of what will or will not happen in the US election, and we will continue to press that with the Australian government and the US government. But of course, the political spectrum, the political context, we have to consider that political context. And so when we have a Labor government here and a Democrat government in the United States, obviously they're going to be able to have, I think, more fruitful conversations. They have similar principles. They are concerned about this case and concerned about, certainly the Labor government has made very clear that they're concerned about Julian and wanting this case to be brought to an end. The Biden administration has a more generalized, principled approach to free speech, which is not playing out in this case. We will not see that from a Trump administration. The Trump administration had deliberately pursued this indictment to pursue this very precedent against the media, and that they will use against the media. And so I think we really need to resolve this case, and as soon as possible, for Julian's health and for his well-being, but also because of what might happen in the future if there's a change of government and the desire of the Trump administration to pursue a precedent like this should be terrifying for every single journalist in the United States and elsewhere.
You've touched a number of times on Julian's health, and I know we've been focused on, I've talked obviously about the politics of it. You've been commenting on the legal implications, but what do we know about Julian's health and how his family is at the moment?
This has had a huge toll on him and his family. Just last night, as the court was deliberating on the decision, I was in contact with Stella, his wife, and for her to be sitting in court not knowing whether her husband and the father of her children may well be put on a plane to prison conditions that will cause his death or not is a terrifying prospect for any family. So obviously we're incredibly relieved, but the toll that it's having on him, this ongoing roller coaster of you could be on a plane tomorrow to the United States. Oh, no, you've got 6 more months. It's terrifying. So people need to also remember, I mean, he didn't appear in court last night because he's not well enough. The court had made provision for him to be transported to court to be there in person, and a decision was made that that was not the right thing given his health circumstances. He did have a mini stroke while attending an earlier court hearing since he's been in Belmarsh. So we are worried. Obviously, that's a sign that something more serious could happen. And so I'm worried about the stress and the pressure that this is having on him. It's been 14 years that he's been under restriction on his liberty. I've been representing him since September 2010. We are fast coming up to September. It's been a very long time that he's been under restrictions of his liberty. He's not been able to be properly cared for. He's not getting enough exercise. He's not getting enough nutrition. He's under a huge amount of pressure. So for me, when we talk about this being a humanitarian issue, it is no exaggeration.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like people who are on this call today to know or to help advocate for Julian's release? Obviously, you are his legal advisor and engaged in the legal case, but we have talked about the fact that essentially the quickest way to end this would be a political outcome, a political result. What can people who are interested in helping Julian's case and making Julian be free again, what can they do to help?
There's so many ways people can help. As I said, this case is political and it requires a political solution. The fact that Australians have been calling their MPs, putting pressure on their local members, raising this with the Attorney General, raising this with the Prime Minister, and continuing to push this, continuing to protest, it has made a difference. When I first was going down to Canberra to do advocacy on this, it was Senator Scott Ludlam from the Greens was the sole person who was willing to meet and talk about this. Our little Bring Assange Home group was a very small group of people from across the political spectrum. And just recently, we've seen 2/3 of Parliament vote for a resolution to call on the US and UK to bring him home. That is a huge political process, and that's because of the work of Australians in the community campaigning, organising, protesting, and putting pressure on our government. So I want to thank all of you on the call who have been involved in that kind of activity and urge you to continue, because it does really make a difference, and it's made a real difference here in Australia. I think also communicating about the case and educating others about what it's really about and why they too should get involved in the campaign. And then, of course, there's ways to contribute and donate to the campaign to support Julian and his family in this very big, long battle, which is always welcome.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for your patience with me being a non-lawyer and for answering so many of the audience questions, Jennifer, and for your time and expertise today. I know you've been involved in this case over a number of years, and to have your time today, we really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting it, and thanks to the Australia Institute for the thinking and thought leadership on this case. It's really welcome. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for your questions. As always, I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but hopefully we've covered across some of the legal implications, some of the political ones, and a few other topics along the way. Thanks so much for your interest today and in Julian's case. This episode was recorded live from our webinar series on Tuesday, the 21st of May, 2024, and things may have changed since recording. We would love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. And our producer is Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.